The Intergalactic Bureau of Dangerous Wildlife Management had, in its infinite bureaucratic wisdom, decided that Form 47B was absolutely essential before anyone could so much as think about hunting the thing that had been systematically devouring colony ships for the past 6 months. Because nothing says urgent threat response quite like requiring 17 different signatures, 3 psychological evaluations, and a notarized statement of intent written in triplicate. Our human participant, currently slouched in a waiting room chair that had clearly been designed for beings with tentacles rather than spines, had been watching this particular circus unfold with the kind of patience that would make a saint weep. The fluorescent lighting buzzed overhead with the enthusiasm of a dying insect, casting everything in that special shade of bureaucratic green that somehow made even the most vibrant alien skin tones look corpse-like. "Next," chirped the receptionist, a being that resembled what would happen if someone crossed a butterfly with a filing cabinet and then gave it a customer service degree from the University of Barely Contained Hostility. The human didn't move. She'd learned, through months of bitter experience, that next in galactic bureaucracy was more of a philosophical concept than an actual instruction, like efficiency or reasonable processing time. Across the waiting area, a Vorthak bounty hunter, all 6 arms gleaming with enough firepower to level a small moon, was gesticulating wildly at his handler. The universal translator was having what could charitably be called difficulties with his dialect, but the general sentiment of "why haven't you idiots approved my application yet?" came through loud and clear. "Sir, I understand your frustration," the handler replied with the tone of someone who had perfected the art of not understanding anything while simultaneously making it sound like a personal failing on the speaker's part. "But your Form 23C indicates you've only hunted 17 different species of megafauna. The minimum for Category 9 threats is 20. The Vorthak's response involved several gestures that were probably illegal in 14-star system. Meanwhile, the human continued her vigil in the corner, occasionally glancing at the holographic displays showing the beast's latest rampage. The thing, officially designated as Specimen X7739, but known to survivors as that unholy fusion of nightmare and physics-defying horror, had just finished making creative use of the hegemony's third fleet. The official casualty report was still pending, but the unofficial report could be summarized as everybody screamed, "Man!" The butterfly filing cabinet had apparently worked its way through the entire queue and was now staring at the human with the kind of polite confusion reserved for finding unexpected objects in one's soup. "Are you waiting for something specific?" The human held up a data pad displaying her application status, pending review day 127. A ripple of what might charitably be called laughter went through the waiting room. The hegemony took pride in its inclusion policies. After all, they'd allowed humans into the galactic community with only minimal conditions like "please don't blow anything up for at least a week," and try to keep the death toll under 4 digits per planetary cycle. But there were limits to tolerance, and apparently those limits involved taking human hunting applications seriously. "Oh," said the receptionist, with the tone of someone who just realized they'd been asked to explain quantum mechanics to a houseplant. "A human hunting application for the Category 9. The Vorthak bounty hunter turned to stare, his compound eyes widening in what was unmistakably amusement. Several other beings in the waiting room, including a crystalline entity that looked like it had been carved from living diamond and a gas cloud creature that smelled faintly of ozone and disappointment, began what could only be described as the galactic equivalent of snickering. "Yes," the human replied with the kind of flat calm that suggested either enlightened patience or a complete break from reality. "That would be correct." The truth was, the Intergalactic Bureau of Dangerous Wildlife Management had never actually processed a human application for anything above Category 5. Category 5 being large predator that might eat you if you're particularly unlucky or stupid. Category 9 was reserved for extinction-level threats that laugh at your concept of physics and use your advanced weaponry as dental floss. The receptionist tapped at her console with increasing desperation, as if the right combination of keystrokes might make this problem resolve itself into something more manageable, like a minor clerical error or gas leak. "The thing is," she said finally, with the air of someone delivering tragic news, "humans are, well, you're categorized as a Class C species for hunting purposes. That means small game only. Rodents, perhaps some herbivorous creatures that pose no significant threat to galactic security." Around the waiting room, the collective amusement was becoming palpable. The crystalline entity was actually chiming, a sound like wind chimes having an argument with a xylophone. The gas cloud was shifting through colors that the universal translator helpfully identified as mirth, condescension, and mild pity. The human nodded thoughtfully, as if this were new information rather than something she'd been told approximately 47 times over the past 4 months. "I see," she said. "And what would it take to get reclassified?" The receptionist's antennae twitched in what was probably the equivalent of a nervous laugh. "Well, you'd need to demonstrate successful hunting of progressively more dangerous specimens, with proper documentation and witness statements. Starting with Category 1 and working your way up, the whole process typically takes, 15 to 20 standard years. Minimum." "Interesting." The human made a note on her datapad. "And in those 15 to 20 years, how many colony ships do you estimate that thing will have eaten?" The waiting room fell silent. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to buzz more quietly, as if they too were contemplating the mathematics of bureaucracy versus apocalypse. The receptionist's wings fluttered uncertainly. That's really more of a question for the Threat Assessment Division." The human stood up, stretched with the unhurried precision of someone who had mastered the art of waiting, and walked toward the exit. "I'll be back tomorrow. Same time," the receptionist called after her, apparently unable to help herself. "Same time," the human confirmed, and disappeared into the corridor beyond. Behind her, the waiting room gradually returned to its normal level of controlled chaos. The Vorthak went back to arguing about his paperwork. The crystalline entity resumed its patient chiming. The gas cloud shifted to colors that translated roughly as well. "That was amusing, and I wonder what she's actually planning." None of them noticed the small device the human had left behind, discreetly attached to the underside of her chair. A device that would, over the coming weeks, quietly record every conversation about hunting protocols, threat classifications, and most importantly, the exact location where the ceremony would take place once someone finally managed to kill the beast. Because if there was one thing humans had learned during their brief but eventful membership in the Galactic community, it was that sometimes the most dangerous hunt wasn't tracking your prey. Sometimes it was waiting for the perfect moment to remind everyone exactly why evolution had made you an apex predator in the first place. The thing currently reducing the hegemony's most advanced dreadnought to scrap metal and existential dread had not technically been awakened by anything so much as mildly inconvenienced by the sudden appearance of several thousand tons of military-grade starship in what it had been using as a feeding ground. To call it a beast was rather like calling a black hole a minor gravitational disturbance. The creature existed in a state of casual contempt for most known laws of physics, which it violated with the same enthusiasm that teenagers showed for curfew. It was roughly the size of a small moon, assuming that small moons typically came equipped with tentacles that could punch through dimensional barriers, and teeth that appeared to be forged from crystallized despair. Admiral Thix-9, commanding officer of the 3rd Expeditionary Force, was currently experiencing what his species called profound tactical re-evaluation, a state roughly equivalent to what humans might term staring into the abyss while the abyss not only stares back but makes rude gestures. "Status report," he managed, though his voice modulator was having difficulty processing the quantum frequencies of abject terror. "Sir," replied his tactical officer, a Gornathi, whose natural blue coloration had shifted to what the universal translator diplomatically termed, "Oh dear, we're all going to die purple. The creature has just, well, it appears to have eaten our plasma bombardment." "Eaten it?" "Consumed, sir. As in opened what we're assuming is a mouth and swallowed 17 direct hits from our main batteries. Our sensors indicate it may have actually gotten stronger." Through the main view screen, they watched as X-7739 stretched what might charitably be called a limb, though it resembled something that would result from crossing a tentacle with a geometric impossibility, and casually batted aside 3 heavy cruisers. The ships tumbled through space with all the dignity of discarded toys, their crews no doubt reconsidering their career choices. "Sir," the communications officer interjected, her translator crackling with interference that might have been cosmic radiation or cosmic irony, "we're receiving a transmission from Fleet Command. They want to know our progress." Admiral Thix-9 stared at the screen, where the creature was now doing something to the fabric of space-time that was probably illegal in several dimensions. Tell them we're making excellent progress toward a complete understanding of our own mortality. The beast specimen, creature, cosmic horror, pick your preferred euphemism for thing that shouldn't exist but does anyway, had first appeared approximately 6 months ago in the Outer Rim sector. The initial reports had been dismissed as hallucinations brought on by prolonged exposure to dark matter, or possibly bad ration packs. This was because the reports described something that was simultaneously the size of a small planet, incorporeal, made of living darkness, and really angry about something. The Galactic Scientific Council had published 17 different papers explaining why such a creature was impossible. X7739 had responded by eating 3 of the scientists who authored those papers, along with their research stations, and what appeared to be a small portion of local space-time. Admiral, the tactical officer, said, with the tone of someone who had moved beyond terror into a kind of zen-like acceptance of the absurd. It's looking at us. Indeed, the creature had turned what everyone hoped was its attention toward their position. Where most beings had eyes, X7739 possessed what could best be described as windows into a reality where geometry went to die screen. These were currently fixed on the 3rd Expeditionary Force, with the kind of interest a child might show toward an interesting bug just before pulling off its wings. All ships, Admiral Thix-9 ordered, implement tactical withdrawal. You mean retreats? I mean, the Admiral replied with dignity, strategic repositioning toward a location that is significantly farther away from that thing. But X7739 had apparently grown bored with the conventional approach to naval combat. Instead of pursuing the fleeing ships, it simply shifted. Not moved. Movement implied a transition through space, and space was clearly beneath the creature's notice. One moment it was several light minutes away. The next it was close enough that its presence was causing the ship's artificial gravity to develop opinions about which direction up should be. The encounter lasted approximately 4 minutes and 37 seconds, though the survivors would later insist it felt like several geological. When it was over, the 3rd Expeditionary Force had been reduced to the Admiral's flagship, 2 badly damaged destroyers, and a supply vessel that had survived entirely by accident after its crew had hidden in the cargo bay and prayed to several different deities simultaneously. The official after-action report would later describe the engagement as a learning experience and valuable data for future tactical planning. The unofficial report, circulated among the surviving crew members, could be summarized as "It eat our missiles," and asked for seconds. Hexion, the hegemony's foremost expert on xenobiology and the proud author of Everything You Never Wanted to Know About Things That Want to Kill You, a comprehensive guide, had spent the last 3 months studying every available piece of data on. His conclusion, reached after extensive analysis and several nervous breakdowns, was both scientifically rigorous and profoundly unhelpful. It shouldn't exist, but it does, and it's getting bigger. The creature appears to feed on various forms of energy, he explained to the Emergency Council, his tentacles writhing in patterns that translated roughly as "please don't shoot the messenger." Plasma, fusion reactions, quantum fluctuations, the life force of sentient beings, and based on our latest observations, abstract concepts like hope and tactical coherence. The Council Chamber, an impressive feat of architecture that had been designed to inspire confidence in galactic leadership, was currently inspiring something closer to collective existential crisis. "What are you saying, Doc?" inquired Counselor Vex, a being whose species had evolved to survive in environments where optimism was fatal. "I'm saying, Doc," Hexion replied, his voice reaching frequencies that made the translator emit small whimpering sounds, that conventional warfare appears to be the equivalent of sending it a dinner invitation with our coordinates helpfully included. The creature's latest rampage had left it approximately 30% larger than when it started, and intelligence reports suggested it had developed new appendages that seemed specifically designed for opening starship hulls like particularly disappointing presents. "So what do you recommend?" asked the council chairman, a crystalline being whose natural luminescence had dimmed to what could only be described as the color of giving up. Hexion's research had led him to one inescapable conclusion: though he was hesitant to voice it in front of beings who had built an entire civilization on the assumption that problems could be solved through the application of sufficient technology and bureaucratic process. "We need," he said finally, "to try something completely different," which was, coincidentally, exactly what the humans sitting in the Bureau of Dangerous Wildlife Management's waiting room had been thinking for the past 127 days. The emergency session of the Galactic Defense Council had all the pomp and circumstance of a state funeral, which was appropriate considering they were essentially planning their own. The great circular chamber, normally filled with the confident chatter of beings who had never met a problem that couldn't be solved with a sufficiently large committee, now echoed with the kind of hushed tones usually reserved for discussing terminal diagnoses. "Ladies, gentlemen, sentient gas clouds and whatever the hell that thing is," announced Chairman Vortex, gesturing vaguely at a delegate whose species apparently existed in 17 dimensions simultaneously. "We are gathered here to discuss our final options regarding specimen." The holographic display in the center of the chamber showed the creature's latest position, currently using the remains of the hegemony's Fourth Fleet as what appeared to be some form of cosmic dental floss. The sight had the curious effect of making even the most warlike species in attendance suddenly develop an interest in diplomatic solutions. "The traditional approaches have proven," Chairman Vortex paused, searching for a euphemism that wouldn't cause mass panic, "pedagogically valuable but tactically insufficient." This was politician speak, for it ate our entire military and asked for dessert. Therefore, he continued with the air of someone about to suggest something profoundly stupid, "We are prepared to authorize alternative hunting method." The chamber erupted in what the universal translator charitably identified as multilingual expressions of disbelief. Beings who had spent centuries perfecting the art of dignified discourse were suddenly reduced to making sounds that would have embarrassed a kindergarten class. "You cannot be serious," declared Ambassador Thys, her crystalline form flickering with indignation. "We're talking about unleashing primitive hunting techniques on a Category 9 threat." "It's unprecedented," supplied Counselor Rex, whose species had invented the concept of precedent specifically to avoid having to deal with situations like this. "Desperate," added another voice from the back of the chamber. "Potentially amusing," observed the gas cloud delegate, whose comment was promptly ignored by everyone present. But desperation, as it turned out, was a remarkably effective motivator. Within 3 standard hours, the council had voted to authorize what they euphemistically termed unconventional hunting protocols. This was bureaucrat speak for, "Let's see what happens when we throw everything at the wall and hope something sticks before we all get eaten." The news reached the Bureau of Dangerous Wildlife Management approximately 6 minutes after the vote, carried by the kind of priority transmission usually reserved for declaring war or announcing the heat death of the universe. The butterfly filing cabinet receptionist stared at her screen with the expression of someone who had just been asked to explain why the laws of physics had decided to take a vacation. "Ma'am," she said to the human who had, as promised, returned for day 128 of bureaucratic limbo, "there's been a development." The human looked up from her datapad, where she had been sketching what appeared to be detailed and anatomical diagrams of something with far too many teeth. "Development?" she asked, with the tone of someone who had learned not to get excited about governmental efficiency. "Your application has been expedited." The waiting room, which had been maintaining its usual level of barely controlled chaos, fell silent. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to buzz more quietly, as if they were afraid of missing something important. "Expedited," the human repeated carefully. "Fast-tracked. Rush processed. Approved pending final authorization from the Emergency Hunting Protocol Committee, which is scheduled to convene in." The receptionist checked her chronometer. 14. Around the waiting room, the assembled beings, including the Vorthak bounty hunter, who had been coming in daily to argue about his paperwork, stared in collective amazement. The crystalline entity actually stopped chiming. The gas cloud shifted to colors that the translator identified as profound confusion and existential bewilderment. "I see," the human said, making a note on her datapad. "And what changed?" The receptionist's antennae twitched nervous. "Well, according to the priority directive from the Defense Council, we are authorized to approve hunting applications from, and I quote, any sentient being, regardless of species classification, technological level, or previous demonstrated competence in not getting themselves killed in spectacularly stupid ways." That's quite a policy shift. The situation has become somewhat urgent. Through the waiting room's windows, They could see the latest news feeds displaying X-7739's most recent accomplishment. Apparently it had learned to fold space-time into origami sculptures, using inhabited solar systems as raw material. The artistic merit was debatable, but the casualty reports were unambiguous. Urgent, the human agreed. I suppose that means the tournament will be starting soon? The receptionist consulted her screen again, her wings fluttering with what might have been panic or possibly excitement. According to this, the Grand Hunt commences in 72 standard hours. Location, the Nexus Arena, Sector 7 Alpha. Expected audience, approximately 4 billion beings across 17 different species. Televised, then. Broadcast across the entire galaxy. The betting pools alone are expected to exceed the GDP of several minor civilizations. The human nodded thoughtfully, as if this were exactly the kind of information she had been waiting for. Which, given her behavior over the past 4 months, it probably was. Excellent, she said, standing up with the fluid motion of someone who had spent considerable time practicing fluid motions. I'll need transport to the Nexus Arena, standard hunting gear requisition forms. And, she paused, consulting her access to the contestant preparation facilities. Of course, ma'am. Standard procedure for all approved hunters. The receptionist's tone had shifted from bureaucratic indifference to something approaching respect, or possibly. It was often difficult to tell the difference in galactic administration. The Vorthak bounty hunter, who had been listening to this exchange with increasing incredulity, finally found his voice. You realize, he said, his translator struggling with the mixture of amusement and concern. That thing has eaten 3 separate military fleets, and you're planning to hunt it with, what, exactly? The human turned to regard him with the kind of calm attention that apex predators reserved for particularly interesting prey. With patience, she said simply. Patience, 4 months of it, to be precise. She walked toward the exit, pausing only to collect the small listening device she had left under her chair months earlier. As she reached the door, she turned back to address the assembled beings who were still staring at her in various states of confusion and disbelief. See you all at the tournament, she said pleasantly. I suspect it's going to be quite educational. The door hissed shut behind her, leaving the waiting room in contemplative silence. It was the crystalline entity who finally spoke, its chimes carrying an odd note that the translator identified as philosophical unease. Anyone else get the feeling, it said, that we've been looking at this whole situation backward? The gas cloud shifted to a color that meant probably, but it's too late to worry about it now. Outside, the human was already making her way toward the transport station, her step light and her expression carrying the satisfied air of someone whose long-term planning was finally about to pay dividends. She had, after all, spent 4 months learning everything there was to know about galactic hunting protocols, bureaucratic procedures, and most importantly, the exact specifications of the Nexus Arena, including its structural weak points, evacuation procedures, and the curious fact that its defensive systems had never been tested against anything that didn't rely primarily on advanced technology. Sometimes, she reflected as she boarded the transport that would take her to destiny and what would undoubtedly become the most watched hunt in galactic history, the best traps were the ones that other people built for you. All you had to do was wait for them to invite you inside. The Nexus Arena had been constructed during the height of the Galactic Empire's bigger is better architectural phase, which explained why it was roughly the size of a small planet, and possessed enough viewing platforms to accommodate the population of several solar systems. Today, those platforms were packed with beings from across the galaxy, all united in their shared desire to watch something, preferably not themselves, get spectacularly devoured by an cosmic horror. The betting pools had indeed exceeded the GDP of several civilizations, with odds heavily favoring outcomes that could be broadly categorized as everyone dies horribly, and everyone dies horribly but faster. The human participant was listed at approximately 47,000 to 1 against, which bookmakers had helpfully labeled as mathematical impossibility. In the contestant preparation area, a space that resembled what would happen if someone combined a high-tech armory with a very expensive funeral home, the approved hunters were making their final preparation. The sight was impressive in the way that natural disasters are impressive, awe-inspiring, terrible, and likely to end badly for everyone involved. Warmaster Thex of the Dominion hegemony had brought enough firepower to sterilize a continent, including plasma cannons that violated several arms treaties and a personal shield generator that could deflect small asteroids. He stood 9 feet tall in his powered armor, bristling with weapons systems that hummed with barely contained violence. Beside him, the Crystalline Consortium's representative, a being whose body was composed entirely of living diamond, was interfacing with what appeared to be a small sun contained within a portable fusion matrix. The device pulsed with the kind of energy typically associated with stellar cores or very expensive mistakes. The HiveMind Collective had sent 300 of their warrior drones, each one a masterpiece of biological engineering, designed specifically for killing things that shouldn't exist. They moved with the fluid precision of a military formation crossed with a ballet troupe, if ballet troupes typically carried antimatter charges. And in the corner, sitting quietly on a standard-issue equipment crate, was the human. She had requisitioned exactly one item from the arena's extensive armory, a simple projectile weapon that most galactic civilizations had stopped using roughly around the time they discovered fire was hot. The weapon looked like something that belonged in a museum dedicated to primitive methods of making holes in things. "Attention, hunters," announced the arena's AI, its voice echoing through speakers that had been designed to make even whispered announcements sound appropriately dramatic. "Specimen X7739 has been successfully contained within the arena perimeter. The grand hunt will commence in 60 seconds. The viewing platforms erupted in a cacophony of cheers, jeers and sounds that didn't translate but probably involved the galactic equivalent of finish. Several gambling syndicates were taking last-minute bets on which contestant would die first, with the human maintaining her commanding lead in that particular category. 50 seconds, the AI continued helpfully. Warmaster Thex activated his weapon systems with a sound like thunder being fed through a blender. The crystalline being's fusion matrix began cycling through energy states that made nearby metal glow with sympathetic heat. The HiveMind drones arranged themselves into attack formations that had names like Death Blossom and Tuesday Morning Genocide. The human checked her weapon's ammunition count, 6 rounds, and made sure her boots were properly laced. 30 seconds. Through the arena's reinforced barriers, they could see X7739 in all its impossible glory. The creature had apparently grown bored with conventional physics and was currently existing in several dimensions simultaneously, which created visual effects that the arena's cameras were struggling to broadcast without causing mass insanity among the viewing audience. 10 seconds, announced the AI. Remember, this is a live broadcast across 17 star systems. Try to die with dignity. The barriers fell. What followed could charitably be described as educational, assuming one wished to learn about the relative effectiveness of advanced military technology versus existential horror. Warmaster Thex led the charge with all the subtlety of a solar flare, his plasma weapons painting the arena in colors that didn't have names in most languages. The shots struck X7739 with enough force to vaporize Small Moon. The creature's response was to briefly glow brighter, like a campfire being fed particularly good kindling. The crystalline being's fusion matrix discharged its entire energy payload in one magnificent burst of stellar fury. The attack was visible from orbit and temporarily blinded several camera drones. When the light faded, X7739 appeared to have grown roughly 15% larger, and developed what might charitably be called a sense of humor, if one's definition of humor involved tentacles that spelled out rude words in 16 different languages. The HiveMind's coordinated assault was a thing of terrible beauty. 300 warriors moving in perfect synchronization to deliver death from every conceivable angle. They lasted approximately 12 seconds before X7739 demonstrated that it could in fact conceive of angles that existed in dimensions where geometry went to weep. The arena fell silent except for the sound of the betting computers frantically recalculating on. And then in that silence came the sound of footsteps. The human walked calmly across the arena floor, stepping over the remains of advanced technology and the confused fragments of beings who had just learned that evolution hadn't prepared them for this particular encounter. Her primitive weapon remained lowered, her expression thoughtful like someone considering a particularly interesting puzzle. X7739 turned its attention to her with the kind of interest a cosmic entity might show toward an unusually persistent microorganism. Reality warped around the creature's presence, causing the arena's structural supports to vibrate in frequencies that most solid matter found philosophically disturbing. The human stopped approximately 50 meters from the creature and raised her weapon. The crowd held its collective breath across 17 star systems. She fired. The projectile, a simple slug of metal propelled by controlled chemical explosion, struck X-7739 with all the dramatic impact of a raindrop hitting a mountain. The creature didn't even seem to notice. The human worked the weapon's action and fired again, and again, and again. 6 shots. 6 tiny pieces of metal that should have been utterly meaningless against a creature that treated physics as more of a suggestion than a law. X-7739 began to scream. It was not a sound that most beings were equipped to process. The arena's translation computers gave up entirely, and began displaying error messages in languages that didn't exist yet. The creature's impossible geometry began to collapse inward, folding through dimensions like origami being unfolded by someone who had forgotten how origami worked. Whispered someone in the crowd, though it was unclear which species the voice belonged to or whether they were still technically alive enough to be asking questions. The human lowered her weapon and watched with professional satisfaction as X-7739 continued its spectacular dissolution. Reality was reasserting itself with the enthusiasm of a bureaucrat who had just discovered a filing error, and the creature was discovering that certain fundamental constants of the universe were significantly less negotiable than it had assumed. Iron, she said, conversationally, though her voice somehow carried clearly across the arena and into the broadcast feeds that were currently breaking viewing records across the galaxy. Specifically, cold iron. Forged on Earth, blessed by 17 different human religious traditions, and inscribed with protective runes from 12 human cultures. X-7739's death throes were creating light shows that would be visible for the next 3 centuries. But the human continued her explanation with the patience of someone who had been planning this lecture for 4 months. The thing about humans, she said, is that we've been dealing with monsters for a very long time. Long before we had plasma cannons or fusion matrices, or the ability to fold space-time into amusing shape. We learned to fight things that laughed at our weapons and ignored our logic and generally treated the laws of nature as mild suggestion. The creature's screaming reached a crescendo that shattered several viewing platforms, and caused 3 different species to spontaneously develop religious beliefs. So we learned to fight them with other things. Stories. Symbols. Faith. Iron. She hefted the primitive weapon with something approaching affection. You see, the universe runs on rules. And the older the rules, the harder they are to break. X-7739 could ignore your advanced technology because technology is new, temporary. But iron forged with intent, blessed with belief, fired with purpose. She shrugged. That's old magic. Universe foundation level. X-7739 gave one final, reality-bending shriek and collapsed into something that might charitably be called normal space-time, leaving behind only a fading impression of cosmic indignation, and approximately 4 tons of what appeared to be crystallized darkness. The silence that followed was the kind of profound quiet that typically preceded either enlightenment or nervous breakdown. The human walked over to the remains, prodded them with her boot to ensure they were thoroughly deceased, and turned toward the viewing platforms where 4 billion beings were experiencing various forms of existential recalibration. Next time, she called out, her voice carrying clearly through the arena's acoustics, you might want to try asking nicely before making someone wait 4 months for paperwork. She collected one small fragment of the crystallized remains, a trophy perhaps, or evidence for her expense report, and walked toward the exit with the unhurried gait of someone whose very long-term planning had just paid off in the most spectacular way possible. Behind her, the betting computers were still trying to calculate odds for an outcome that their programmers had never imagined possible. Everyone lives, except the cosmic horror which dies confused. The irony, of course, was that the entire galactic community had spent months dismissing human hunting applications, because they assumed primitive methods couldn't possibly be effective against advanced threats. They had failed to consider that some threats were so advanced they had circled all the way back around to being vulnerable to primitive methods. It was, the human reflected as she boarded her transport home, exactly the kind of oversight that happened when you let bureaucrats run the universe instead of hunters. Though she had to admit, the 4 months of waiting had been excellent for planning.